Chapter 12. Day 2, Thursday. Doreen woke up the next morning to a sore back and the not-so-musical sound of the bed springs. Muggs had taken up residence at the base of the bed near her feet. Goliath had taken up the other half of the bed. And yes, Thaddeus appeared to be snoozing on that old metal railing at her feet. And every time she rolled, the bed spring squeaked and groaned. Not sure how long I can live with this noisy, tortuous bed. It's not conducive for actual sleeping. But getting a new bed is out of the question for a while. She stared up at the old ceiling and thought, although it would take a lot of time, effort, and money to fix the house, it was a gift in her time of need. It was a far cry from where she'd been, but it was hers alone. There was a certain sense of peace and security with that. With a hard realization, she looked back over the years where she'd spent money indiscriminately, because it was always available. It was there. She'd bought jewelry, clothes, and knickknacks for the house, and she'd never thought to put away any cash. When she'd married, she had believed in forever. And sure, she'd wanted out of her marriage a lot of times. But it had never occurred to her she would be replaced. How was that even fair? Or legal? She'd been married for 14 years. He had built up his business during that time, with her help as his hostess for all his social events. She had no intention of ripping off her husband, but she'd wanted some compensation for all those years she had invested her time and effort into his businesses. But according to her lawyer, Doreen wasn't entitled to anything of his, including the house, his cars, and their bank accounts. The only reason she had the Honda was that it had been her personal car before they married, and she had convinced her husband to keep it, if only for having on standby so the maid could run to the grocery store. So Doreen was lying here, not even able to afford a new bed, and he had the contents of the whole house to himself. Well, he and his new arm candy, Doreen's divorce lawyer. Doreen did have one thing from her marriage: her survivor's spirit. Of course, she'd been the fool for signing the divorce agreement, only she hadn't realized it until afterward, when it was too late. Or was it? She'd revisit that thought later. One crisis at a time, please. She threw back the covers, hopped out of bed, and walked over to the bathroom. Once again, she stopped in the doorway and smiled. Not only did she have her spirit, she had this bathroom. And this was one room in the house that mattered. She danced inside and turned on the shower, delighted to feel lovely hot water almost instantly with copious pressure. After a vigorous scrub and several shampoos of her hair, she almost felt clean again. Between the dead body and rummaging through the weeds, she was dang sure she'd brought in more than her fair share of the dirt. She'd like to blame the animals, but she'd been in and out constantly herself. Back in her room, she opened her biggest suitcase, looking for a pair of pants she could wear around the house. She had no idea what she was supposed to do with all her expensive clothes. Her designer shoes. The thought of ever wearing them here was highly unlikely. Could she sell them? She knew it was probably a foolish idea. But she'd do almost anything to get a new bed. Once again, the animals waited for her as she made her way, now dressed, to the kitchen for her next attempt at making a pot of coffee. While it dripped, she fed the animals. At least their food would last them for a while. Then she turned her attention to herself because, after all, dinner had been almost nothing, and this morning's offerings weren't looking much better. With a fresh cup of coffee, she opened the fridge, another archaic-looking thing she couldn't believe still worked. She'd seen them in old movies, but never imagined they'd be in household use today. It was empty except for a box of baking soda on the shelf. She didn't understand why that was there. The half-freezer above was also empty. So Nan had used up or given away or tossed all the perishable food before she left, and that was probably a darn good thing. But it also meant Doreen couldn't put off grocery shopping for much longer. She gathered all that was left of her traveling food on the table, some dried fruit and nuts. Obviously, that was her breakfast. As soon as she ate, she grabbed her purse, poured the last of the coffee in her travel mug, and headed for her car. As she opened the front door, she gasped to see an older woman, her hand in the air, ready to knock. The two women stared at each other in surprise, before Doreen pulled herself together. "Hi. How can I help you?" The older woman smiled. "I'm Ella, your neighbor." She turned to point at the house on the far right of the cul-de-sac. "I just wanted to say hello, and to welcome you to the neighborhood. It's been a bit rough for you, so I wanted to let you know we're not all nosy busybodies." How lovely. Doreen beamed at the first true welcome she'd had. "Thank you so much. You're right. Yesterday was a bit rough, but today is a new day." Ella laughed. "I see you're heading out." She motioned at the travel mug in Doreen's hands while backing down the front porch steps. "So feel free to stop by and say hi sometime. We'll have a cup of tea together." She skipped down the last few steps, waved, and strode home, leaving Doreen to stare after her neighbor, wondering if she should have changed her plans and visited with the woman. Still, the moment had passed. Shrugging, Doreen got into the car. Nan had said a grocery store was just down the road. If nothing else, Doreen could live on bread and peanut butter for a while. The peanut butter was a memory from her childhood. She'd never been allowed to have it while married. Like so many other things. She hated to leave all the animals inside the house. Plus, she expected the cops back again, but she had to leave before they blocked her in once more. She drove down Lakeshore Road, ignoring the many people out walking their animals and staring at her. Several blocks later, she came to a grocery store. She pulled into a parking spot, got out, grabbed a cart, and went in. Now she had to enter that food nightmare. If she could cook, it would be a different story, but chances were she'd burn everything. Although the coffee this morning had tasted like coffee, which was a huge improvement. She still didn't understand the mystery of grocery stores. She understood fresh food was supposed to be on the outside perimeter, and the food she was to avoid was on the inside of the store. Why would they sell food that you're supposed to avoid? And why put it in the middle of the store, exactly where everyone was going? Her husband had been a fresh food freak, and that was great, as she'd obviously remembered some of his rantings. She wandered down the store aisles, figuring out just what she could buy in this small town with an even smaller budget. She quickly collected fresh greens, spinach, and kale. Maybe she could get her smoothies back into her routine again. She didn't know if Nan had a blender. Checking the second-hand store for one was a place to start. Maybe she could find a teapot too. She kept on going through the fresh veggies, picked up some fruit, and wandered into the meat section. This was where that whole cooking mystery began. Nothing made sense to her. But she needed to eat protein too. By the time she finished her shopping, she was confused, tired, and frustrated. But she pushed her small cart to the cashier. The clerk, Cherry according to her name tag, gave her a wide-eyed look, then pinched her mouth shut and rang up the groceries. Doreen assumed Cherry must have heard about the body. Figures. Doreen pushed her prepaid card into the card reader and punched in her security code so she could access her remaining funds, heaving a breath of relief when the transaction was approved. She had saved most of her allowance, then had bought a prepaid card before she made the 5-hour drive here. She didn't want to carry any cash on her while traveling alone, and she felt the prepaid card was safer, plus it was insured for theft. But she did need to check its balance. She was afraid to look and confirm how little was left, but at the same time, she needed to know the exact figure. She sighed, deciding to check the balance once she got home. Just as silently, she grabbed her bags, put them in the cart. She thanked the clerk with a polite smile before wheeling the cart to her car. It was such a relief to be back out in the fresh air and sunshine again, and to not have to worry about anybody saying anything. As she thought about it though, nobody spoke to her at all, as if a town conspiracy of silence was the best way forward. When she drove into her driveway and parked, 2 unmarked vehicles were already parked at the curb. She figured they were cops working in the back garden. She opened her trunk, pulled out her bags, and walked up to the front of the house. Instantly Muggs barked. "Muggs, it's okay. It's just me." Muggs barked again, not having any of it. Since strangers were in the street and the backyard, she couldn't blame him. She unlocked the front door, let the dog race outside to confirm nothing was there, and carried the bags to the kitchen. Setting everything on the table, she walked back to close the front door. She shrugged out of her sweater, laid it over the back of the couch, dropped her purse on the kitchen table beside the groceries, and opened the rear kitchen door so she could step out and see what was going on. Muggs barreled ahead of her. Sure enough, 4 men were in the garden where she had found the arsenic last night. She recognized Mac, who raised a hand in greeting. Beside him, she acknowledged Chester and Arnold with a wave and returned to the house. She stood just inside the door and wondered aloud, should I put on coffee? Or tea? I'd offer cookies if I was at home. She frowned, walking over and staring out the kitchen window. She'd been forced to learn a lot of etiquette rules when she'd been married, as they were different from the ones for unmarried women, according to both her uppity mother and her controlling husband. It had taken forever before any of it came naturally to Doreen, but eventually, it had. With her separation, that had been one of the first things she'd stopped worrying about. Until moving here for some reason. She decided it was probably prudent to be ready with coffee, if Mac did come in. At least she'd have a cup for him. So she put on a second pot. It was a small pot after all, and she'd drink it all herself if she had to. She quickly set the coffee to dripping, put her perishable foods in the fridge, and then figured out where to put a few canned goods of her choosing when the cupboards were already full. A knock came at the back door. Mac filled the open doorway. She smiled brightly at him. "Good morning." "Good morning. You weren't here when we arrived, so we went straight into the backyard." She nodded. "I needed to get a few groceries." Her tone was formal. Even though she was trying to be friendly, it was still odd to see somebody like him doing what he was doing. He nodded formally as well. "How was your night?" "Outside of the fact that you were here late last night, and the bed I slept in must be from the early 1900s, and every time I rolled over, the bed squeaked and bounced and pinched my spine." She gave him a wan smile. "I'll probably be heading for a nap at noon, because it was so bad." "Sorry about that." He winced. "It's really important to have a good bed." "Well, I won't be getting one anytime soon, since I have no money for anything like that." He shrugged. "At least you have a home." She gave him a flat stare. "There is that." "You know," Mac began. Her eyebrows raised, she waited for him to continue. "I don't mean to meddle," he said. "Go on. I can at least listen to what you have to say, then I'll decide. Right? You could have an estate sale." But, isn't that when someone has died?" "Call it a garage and house sale, if it makes you feel better. Get rid of what Nan doesn't want and buy a new bed." She wasn't sure what that type of sale entailed, but it was an idea. She just wasn't sure it was a good one. And would it actually bring in enough money to buy a bed? You could make it one day, or a weekend, or even a 1-week-long neighborhood event, where you could get the neighbors to join in. It would give the community a new way to view you, after all this murder business. Her eyebrows shot up at that. "I don't know," she said slowly. "I will consider it, but it's going to take time to sort through this stuff." I have to ask Nan about most pieces. There's no rush though, is there? He smiled at her. Except you could use a new bed sooner than later. With a nod of her head, she said, "Thank you, Mac." Thaddeus walked in and straight up to Mac. "Thaddeus is here. Thaddeus is here." She smiled down at the bird. "Good morning, Thaddeus." He tilted his head sideways and rolled one eye up at her. He hopped onto the kitchen counter and walked back and forth. "Coffee. Coffee. Thaddeus smells coffee. Thaddeus smells coffee." "I've never heard that word out of him before," she exclaimed. She brushed a finger down the bird's neck. "I really have no idea what I'm doing with him." "Looks like you're doing just fine." "Just goes to show you that appearances can be deceiving." She straightened and gave Mac a pleasant smile. "Did you need something?" He nodded. "That's why I came in before we left." "Left?" She glanced out at the garden and saw it was indeed empty. "Oh, good. You don't have to sound quite so happy." "Given what I've been through these last 24 hours, I so do. I want this over with." She motioned at the coffee. "Would you like a cup? It's fresh." His face lit up. "I'd love a cup, thank you." He pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down at the table. "Besides, I have some questions for you." Crap. She knew she shouldn't have been so friendly. "Questions about what?" she asked as she poured 2 cups full of coffee. "Questions about the murdered man."